I don't object. Siamo a posto? Sì. Buongiorno a tutti. Siamo qui per questo incontro molto...
Good afternoon and welcome to this long-expected meeting, very important for the culture and the expectations of the Rimini meeting. We'll be talking about religion. Topics that have to do with peaceful coexistence between people, freedom of religions, topics that are very dear to the spirit of the meeting and which have always been dealt with in this Rimini meeting. In this year's title we have the heart, so inevitably we had to reflect upon this topic. I mean, a lot has been said on religious persecutions, what it means to acknowledge and respect other religions of different areas of the world. This afternoon in particular we'll be dealing with a very specific, distinctive topic which has also raised the interest of the public opinion. A lot has been said already on the importance, on the case rather, of the crucifix and on the topic of the religious presence in our public space. Obviously we can look at it from different perspectives. There are people who think that the very idea of a religion that has something to say to the public dimension implies denying the secularism of the state. Others are aware that it is important to stress the identity and that religion is indeed a display of identity. Without implying a monopoly of any identity, it simply implies the possibility of interacting, of having a dialogue between different peoples and cultures. With reference to the crucifix in particular, there are those who have mentioned the presence of specific symbols within a classroom or within any public building. And again, we can look at the topic from a different angle. Some have considered this as a way to understand better what we mean by democracy and pluralist democracy. And then there is yet another perspective, those who think that this presence has to be abolished, that everybody has the right not to see and not to listen to, not to feel anything, because this would be in clear contradiction with fundamental rights that each and every one of us has. So there are many angles that you can look at this topic from. We know that it's an ongoing subject, and we have a few distinguished guests today. All of them are friends of the Rimini meeting, so we will dwell upon this topic in the next three presentations, starting from the most specific part, which has been entrusted to Joseph Weiler, director of the Straus Institute of the New York University, a great and long-standing friend of the Rimini meeting.
Spero che tanti di voi
I hope many of you had the opportunity of listening to him on the topic of Bible and marriage. It's been very interesting. Then, the second presentation will be held by Professor Giorgio Feliciani, Professor of Canon Law at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milan. Welcome. And then, thirdly, last but not least, Giuliano Amato, who, for obvious reasons, needs no introduction. Welcome here in his official role as president of the Italian encyclopedia Treccani. So we'll go on talking for roughly 1 hour and a half. Each of the speakers will have about slightly less than half an hour, and we really hope that this will be an enriching meeting and with a lot of food for thought to better understand what it means to be present in the Italian society in the public space. First speaker, Joseph Weiler, please. Thank you very much. Giuliano, Giuliano, I need your help. This morning I held a presentation on the Bible, a small room, and very few people listening to it. It was a very religious topic. This afternoon, I'm no longer speak about religion. I will speak about the politics of religion. Huge room, hundreds of people listening to me. Now, how could I what's a possible explanation behind this? I mean, one which is more flattering to myself, that people are simply more interested about politics of religion rather than in religion itself. Or, second hypothesis, people are more interested in Giuliano Amato than in Joseph Weiler. Two options. Now, if you come back next year and to hold a presentation on the Bible, then we can check who is right, or which of the option is more true. Anyway, let's get real, let's get serious, because the question about religious symbols in the public space is no joke. As you all know, constitutionally, Italy is a secular country, but nevertheless, the strong tradition of showing crucifixes in the classroom. This is part of the culture and tradition in Italy. In November 2009, there was a decision of one of the chambers of the European Court in Strasbourg, and 7-0 was the score, so they blamed 100% Italy for the presence of crucifixes in the Italian classrooms. So this is very serious if you think. And they start from the assumption, from the very radical assumption. It was not just a decision of on a single or specific case. They used the same assumption for the whole of Europe. The state has to be neutral. The presence of a religious symbol in a classroom is no longer neutral. It is no sign of neutrality. Therefore, Italy has been condemned in violation of the covenant. And at the same time, all those countries that are displaying religious symbols in public space are equally in violation of the convention. Obviously, Italy appealed against this decision at the great chambers, 17 judges. It's the top institution within the top group within that institution. So Italy received support from Russia and San Marino, for instance, and many others. And they invited me to represent them in the European Court in Strasbourg. And I can give you a flavor of how the proceedings work in this great chamber. I have a video here, 4 minutes, just to give you an idea, just to give you a flavor of how the proceedings went on. There is no final decision as yet. It will be by the end of the year, maybe beginning of next year. After this short video of 4 minutes, what I would like to do is read my plaidoyer in front of the European Court, attempting to convince them that by condemning Italy they really took the wrong decision. So I will show you this short video. Please bear with me for the for the bad quality of the sound, but I took it from the internet.
Asseyez-vous, je vous prie.
Please be seated.
Opening states, I give the floor to Professor Weiler. Mr. Weiler, please.
May it please the Court, I have the honor to represent the 8 intervening states, all of whom are of the opinion that the Second Chamber erred in its reasoning and interpretation of the Convention and in its subsequent conclusions. Now make no mistake, Your Honours, in many of these non-laic states, large segments of the population, maybe even a majority, are no longer religious themselves. And yet the continued entanglement of religious symbols in its public space and by the state is accepted by the secular population as part of their national identity. I am sure that the thousands or tens of thousands singing with gusto, "God Save the Queen," many of them do not believe in God. But they would be appalled if somebody came and said, "You have to change the British national anthem." It is part of their identity of being British. Now, it might be that someday the British or the English will change their mind and decide that they want to disestablish the church, change the anthem, redraw their flag, etc. It is their democratic and constitutional right to do that. But it's for them to do, not for this distinguished court. And the Convention certainly does not require them to do that. Italy has the right to be and choose to be a laic state. And I don't think this court should be invited to interpret the Italian constitution and to impose the strictures of the Italian constitution on Italy. Leave that job to the Italian courts. Italy has the right, if it wants, to be a laic state. But what Lautzi would have this court do is to impose on it the duty to be a laic state. That cannot be. That is not a correct interpretation of this convention. There is no duty of laicite on the members of the European Convention on Human Rights. The Europe of the Convention represents a unique balance between individual liberty of and from religion and the collective liberty to define the state and nation using religious symbols and even having an established church. Laicite is no more neutral than a religious worldview. How do we resolve this issue? We resolve it by teaching tolerance. The French, with the naked wall, have in their curriculum to teach their children respect for religious people and for different religions. Countries like Italy, who choose to have a crucifix as part of the very way and identity and self-understanding, have to teach their children respect for those who do not believe, for those who are agnostic or atheists. France with a crucifix on the wall is not a France. Italy with a crucifix on the wall is not a Italy. Let's not change that. Thank you.
Vorrei dire che quella carica ho fatto pro bono. Che non dico. Mi chiamo Joseph Weiler, professore.
Now, let me start. My name is Joseph Weiler, professor of law at the New York University and honorary professor at the London University. I have the honor representing the government of Bulgaria, Armenia, Cyprus, Greece, etc. All the third parties believe that the second chamber made a mistake in its reasoning and in its interpretation of the European Convention, and especially in its conclusions. The chamber, in its deliberation, gets to three very clear principles. There is agreement with two of the countries and disagreement with the third one. They agree on the fact that convention guarantees to the individual freedom of religion and freedom from religion, the so-called positive and negative religious freedom. They also fully agree on the need that a classroom is there to educate on the values of tolerance and pluralism. The Chamber also comes up with the principle of neutrality. Listen very carefully. This is what the Chamber stated. The duty of neutrality and impartiality of every state is incompatible with any decision on its part to establish, to give any particular, pass any judgment on religions and the different expressions of that religion. This is part of the motivation given by the Chamber to condemn Italy. Now, starting from this assumption, the conclusion is unavoidable. The display of a crucifix on the wall of a classroom has been considered expression of religion, Christianity in this kind, and therefore a violation of the convention. Now, this principle of neutrality in this case is based on two mistakes, which unfortunately do not have a positive impact on the conclusions. Firstly, in the system laid down in the convention, all the members are supposed to guarantee to the individual's freedom of religion, but at the same time liberty from religion. This obligation, it lies within the constitutional framework of Europe. It is nevertheless counterbalanced by a great degree of liberty when we come to religion or the religious heritage belonging to the collective identity of the nation and the collective symbols of the state. So on the one hand we have the individual freedom and the collective freedom on the other hand. There have been members who said that secularism is part of the constitution of the state. In France, take Article 1 of the Constitution, it is clearly stated that France is a secular, a lay state, and therefore there can possibly be no religious symbol which is accepted by the state in any public space. Religion in a secular state is a private affair, is covered by privacy, but no state under the convention is obliged to accept the principle of secularism. On the other side of the English Channel there is the United Kingdom. There too they have a state church, and the state, the head of the church coincides with the head of state. Religious leaders also automatically belong to the legislative. In the flag you can find the cross, and in the national anthem the national is a prayer to God to save the Queen and to grant the Queen victory and glory, even if sometimes God doesn't listen, as it happened in a recent soccer match. On that same day England lost to South Africa, so obviously God wasn't listening. Anyway, in this very definition of state with an official church, England, in ontological terms, so how it is in England, would seem to be also in violation of the decision of the Chamber. How could it be possible to say that with all those symbols you are not violating the legitimacy of a religious belief? I mean, we don't mean to say that everybody has to say either Christian or Catholic or Anglican, but it is taken for granted that there's nothing wrong in being Christian or Catholic if you take those many symbols that are present. In Europe there are a variety of different relations between state and church. More than half the countries in Europe cannot be considered secular, and inevitably in state education, state-run education, religion and its symbols have their place, have their role. Many of these symbols express a religious identity, and in Europe, for instance, the cross, the crucifix, is the most evident symbol. It is present on many flags, buildings, etc. It would be a mistake to state, as some did, that the cross would simply be a national symbol. It is not. It is equally a religious symbol, and also it would be wrong to assume that it has only a religious meaning. It is both things, if you take into account the history of many European nations. And then I added something. Please be careful. There are certain scholars that think even the 12 stars of the Council of Europe have the same nature. Have you ever wondered why the flag of the Council of Europe has only 12 stars? Some say that it was the 12 founding countries. It is not true. Maybe the 12 apostles or the 12 tribes, I don't know. But in the very flag of the Council of Europe there is a religious symbol, the star, the 12 stars.
Era bella vedere la faccia dei giudici a quel momento.
You should have seen the judge's face at that moment when I said this. Anyway, let's take a look at a picture of the Queen of England displayed in a classroom in England. Just like the cross, that picture has a double meaning. It's the image of the head of state and also the image of the head of the English church, the Anglican church. It's a bit like the Pope, who is at the same time a head of state and the head of a church. I mean, would it be acceptable that somebody would ask to remove the pictures of the Queen because it's not compatible with religious principles or any other principles of education because one is Christian or Catholic or Jewish or of any other belief? Could the German or the Irish constitution no longer be present in a classroom or no longer be read in a classroom, since in their preambles you can find reference, well, in the Irish one, to the Holy Trinity and to Jesus Christ the Holy Lord, and in the second, the German one, a reference to God is made. Certainly the right of freedom from religion must guarantee that anyone or a pupil who objects against this that he could be excluded from a religious ritual, or that any religious participation should be a prerequisite for enjoy other rights. I mean, any pupil must have the right to refrain from singing to sing "God Save the Queen" at the school assembly, if this goes against his or her own beliefs, or if this is different from their vision of the world. But could this only pupil also request that also all the others refrain from singing it? And here I have to tell you a short story, which is also funny. It has to do with my own personal history. My mom grew up in Africa, in Congo, and the only school for white people was a Catholic church, a Catholic college. They were of a Jewish family, but nevertheless my mom went to the Catholic college. My mom. But there was agreement between her family and the school. So whenever they would sing Jesus, she would simply sing Moses. Just swap names.
Una bella storia anche di tolleranza.
It is a nice story. Tolerance. Well, the European situation, whereby we have France on the one hand and UK on the other side. Well, this European situation is indeed an example of pluralism and tolerance. All children throughout Europe, be them atheists or believer, be them Christians, Muslims or Jews, learn as part of their being European that Europe may grant their right to follow their own religious, obviously complying also with the rights of other people and of law and order, and they also enjoy the right not to believe at all. As part of the pluralism and tolerance, Europe accepts and respects France and the United Kingdom, Sweden on the one hand, and Denmark, Greece and Italy, all of which, in completely different ways, recognize religious symbols that are accepted by the state in public spaces. This is what Europe is about. This as a lesson of pluralism and tolerance, indeed. In many of these non-secular states, though perhaps the overwhelming majority of the population are not truly believers, and yet the presence of religious symbols in the public spaces is accepted by the state, by the population, even secular population, as if it were part and parcel of their state identity, and as an act also of tolerance towards their compatriots that are believers. It could happen, for example, that the UK subjects, in compliance with their religious superiority, could do away with their Church of England, but as the Swedes do. But this is something that they have to take care of themselves. That is not to be entrusted to the European Court of Human Rights. Well, Italy is free to be secular. The Italian citizens, democratically, based on the Constitution, may decide to have a secular state. Or, if a secular state, they can decide whether they want their cross displayed in the classroom or not. But the applicant, Mrs. Lautzer, didn't want that the court could recognize the right of Italy to be secular, but they want the court to impose on Italy the duty to be secular, and this has no base in the law. In modern Europe, the countries have opened up their doors to many migrant workers, and we have to offer these new residents, these new migrants, an equal, right treatment. We have to welcome them warmly. We shouldn't discriminate against them. But tolerance for your neighbor should not become intolerance vis-à-vis one's own identity. This is the imperative of the Convention. And the obligation of the states to allow for religious freedom should not become an unjustified and unparalleled imperative imposed on the state to do away with part of its cultural identity just because this identity could also be of religious origin. The stance as taken by the Grand Chamber is not an expression of pluralism, which should be implicit in the spirit of the Convention, but it is just an imposition on the side of the secular state. And so following the court rulings, we could not just but turn Europe into America, Americanizing Europe. There should be just one rule following everybody, as it is the case in America, making a very clear-cut distinction between the church and the state, as if we couldn't trust the fact that the peoples of those member countries whose principles are secular follow again the pattern of democracy. This is not what Europe is. Europe of the Convention is an compromise between personal liberty from a religion and the collective liberty to define a state also using religious symbols, or choosing to have a state religion. We trust our courts, including also the European Court, to safeguard individual liberty. This is a compromise that has served Europe very well over the past 6 decades. And we shouldn't change that. this is a balance that can also provide some kind of guidance for the rest of the world, because it proves to the country that believe that democracy should imply also the loss of one's religious identity, that this is not indeed the case. The ruling by the Grand Chambre basically upturned this unique example of balanced approach, and runs the risk of flattening down vision, considering that there's one institution who should be considered as more important. The court should go back to a situation of balance. I'd like now to move on and identify the second conceptual mistake made by the Grand Chambre, this confusion between neutrality and secularism. In modern states, the principal division is not between Catholic and Protestant, but rather between believer and non-believer, lay citizens. So secularism is not an empty category, which just means the lack of faith. Many indeed believe that category supporting the political conviction whereby religion only may be expressed in the private sphere. And now I'd like to say something that I never referred to the court so far. You may think that the religious man only always rejects the secular option, and this is not the case. I know of many religious people who believe that the right way to organize the state is a secular organization, with religion remaining at the main of the private sphere. You may be certainly a believer and believing that the French system is the best state-wise, and the opposite is true as well. You may be an atheist, your full identity being that of an atheist, and have no objection to the fact that the state is not secular. I know of many British, many Danish, many Greek that are atheists, but accept that there could be religious symbols in the public spaces. So there's no coincidence between the personal condition and the political principle. There's another very important thing for this audience especially. We're talking about freedom of religion, freedom from religion. You may think that the believer, the religious man, may insist on a religious freedom, the free choice of religion, whereby the atheist would like to see freedom from religion, but this is not the case. I, for myself, for example, am a religious man, and I insist importantly on the freedom from religion. Not just because I am liberal and pluralistic in my approach, but also because from the religious perspective, as Pope Ratzinger said in Regensburg, there's no religious meaning in a religious action that is imposed on by the state. That would be no religion whatsoever. And I'm sure that you know this very well. You're very familiar with this concept because this is something that Don Giuliano trusted wholeheartedly. He was constantly insisting that a forced religion, that a forced religious action that is not chosen independently has no meaning whatsoever. So the idea that the religious man only wants the freedom of religion and does not care about the freedom from religion is a lie. Now, I'm trying to be brief, and I've said this over and over again, and I think I can say it yet another time, and I'll try and say it as briefly as possible. Once and for all, we should do away with that nonsense based on which the secular state is neutral. This is not true. The secular state certainly has a most honorable stance. The position of the secular state is one that can be accepted, be that the French stance or American stance. Well, the stance of France and America are different. But there is a difference. I know that you're known as the subtle man. He's my mentor. Anyway, secularity in itself is not a neutral principle in the political division between those who believe that the best way to solve the problems between state and government is that the religion should just be confined to the personal sphere, and those who maintain that the state may display religious symbols. Well, either you believe one thing or the other. No one, neither the other, is neutral, though, as a stance. And now I'd like to close on that. I would also like to make a comment on the classroom. So I'd like to tell you a story of Mark and Leonardo, two friends who are about to go to school for the first time. Leonardo meets Marco at home. He walks in and he sees the crucifix, and then he asks his friend, "What is this?" "Well, it is a crucifix. So why don't you have one at home?" says the friend. "Each home should have one." And then Leonardo goes back to home with some kind of anxiety. And so the mom tells him, "They are true believers. We follow our own convictions, which are as noble, so we are just as good as the other people." Now, think that Marco goes to Leonardo, and Marco would say, "Wow, no crucifix. How's that? A naked wall?" "We don't trust these absurdity," Leonardo said. And Marco then goes back to school all in anxious. "How come we have a crucifix? This is total absurdity to have a crucifix on the wall." And then his mom would explain, "Yes, we do have our convictions, and our convictions is that we believe in God and we want to have the crucifix." The next day, they both go to school. So there are two possibilities there. We could have a school with a crucifix and one without. In the case of the school with crucifix, Leonardo would say, "You know, the school is exactly like my friend's house. Are you sure that it is okay with us not having a crucifix on the wall?" So this is the core of the case as started by Lao Tzu. Think of that about going to school and finding just a naked wall. In that case, Marco would go back home stating, "You know, the school is exactly like Leonardo's house. So, as I told you, it is totally absurd to have a crucifix on the wall." So there's no neutral position. With or without the crucifix, you're always taking a stance. So how do we get out of that? We have to teach people to be tolerant. Many Jews friends said, "How come that you as a Jew went there to defend the cross?" No, I wasn't there for that. I wasn't defending the crucifix. I was there to defend the possibility for Italian citizens to define their own identity, considering what their past traditions are. This is the idea that I wanted to defend. This is a fundamental right that I meant to defend. Had I been an Italian citizen, and I lived here 7 years, but at the time I didn't have children. But my wife and I did talk about that. We were talking about the possibility of us being here in Italy, sending our children to school as Jews. What have we done? What would we do? What would we say to our children going to school and seeing the crucifix? We would have told them, "You know, we're Italian. Italy has its own past, its own identity, and Italy has always been closely related to the Christian faith. So, as Italians, we agree on this display of the crucifix, and yet, as Jews, we enjoy full citizenship. You may become the Prime Minister in Italy. There's no discrimination against you as a Jew, as being an atheist or a non-Christian or a Muslim. There's no religious discrimination whatsoever. The fact is that the crucifix is part and parcel of the Italian identity. When you walk in a school in Israel, it would be totally normal to see the symbol of the state. And menorah was in the old temple, in all the doors, even with the majority of Jews being atheists, that there's always the symbol of our religion, because again, this is part and parcel of our state identity. Irrespective of people walking there being believer or non-believer. This is what I would have thought to my children. Thank you very much.
Beh, noi tutti sappiamo che la prima decisione.
We all know full well that the full rulings on the Lauti case was a 7-0, and 7-0 was also the decision against torture. So actually, we certainly have an uphill task if we want to reverse the Lauti's rulings. But I believe that also the arguments put forward by Professor Weiler are an uphill task to refute. And now we're going to talk again about the presence of religious in the public state. I'm going to skip much of my speech because Professor Weiler has been quite clear in that. I'd like to make a preamble. The presence of religion in the public spaces is inevitable, generally speaking. And why is that? Well, there are two sets of reasons why this is the case. Individual believers, irrespective of the religion, embrace their religion as part and parcel of their own destiny. Hence, religion, irrespective of which religion, proposes its own conception of life and death, and identifies a certain stance vis-à-vis the reality. And this stance, in a way, permeates whatever sphere of life, personal things and political things alike. And we could quote quite a number of examples to testify to that. Just think, for example, about clothing or food, especially so for the Jews and the Muslims. Just think about the attitude vis-à-vis peace and armaments. And I'm relying, obviously, to familiar examples. Think about the way we welcome foreigners and migrant workers. Think about also the opposition between voters and elected government. On the whole, the religious phenomenon should pave the way to different groups of the church, the religious groups, who have their own authorities, rules and networks, affecting the most relevant time of a citizen's life, as the wedding, for example. So these groups make up an important component of the civil society, so much so that oftentimes they contributed and still contribute to the definition of a certain people and the cultural identity. This is true in the field of literature, architecture, music, painting. Professor Weiler already provided us with a number of significant examples, telling us about the public importance of religion in different countries. If I may, I wish to add to that in the US, the White House itself is the institution which better sums up the religious tradition in the United States, as we read on the papers, because during the electoral campaign, the president always talks about God and talks about his religion also in public speeches and in the most solemn time of national life. Oftentimes references made to God. Sometimes also when it wouldn't be necessary. We can't even say that religion is totally absent in the public spaces as normally identified as very hostile, as France is. The French President of the Republic enjoys a privilege to appoint two Catholic bishops. He is the one to appoint. He is indeed the only head of state appointing bishops. And he is also a member of the Church of St. John Lateran. You know what I mean by that. Well, he's the president of a group of priests whose task is that of making the celebration of the cult more important. So not only he is an honorary member of that, and he actually enjoyed this role. Let's read what Sarkozy said when he took up his role as that. Secularity may not remove Catholic roots from France. Secularism tried to do that, and it shouldn't have. As Benedict XVI stated, I agree that this is the country with a spiritual religious ethics. And I believe that who goes against this goes against one's own culture and perpetrates a crime against the culture. Well, this you may consider that just as paying lip service, but there are facts that we should identify. In France, Catholic schools are fully integrated in the public education system. And please note that in France, we don't talk about public institutions, but about national education. And Catholic schools are part and parcel of that, and they even receive financing from the state, which does not happen in Italy with a concordato. I'm not just praising France, I'm just identifying facts. And there's another recent piece of news that I'd like to refer to you upon. Faced with the criticism as levied by the bishops against the negation of Sarkozy, the competent minister didn't say that the bishop should just deal with souls and the devotion to Madonna. Indeed, or in fact rather, stated that bishops are fully competent in having a say, so much so that he said that he was willing to meet also the members of the Episcopal College. Well, I'm not sure such things would happen in Italy anyway. Professor Amato is very competent about that and knows fully well that this is not the case in Italy. It is therefore self-evident that the tradition of different countries with reference to the presence of religion in public spaces, so the reaction of different states are very different, as Professor Weiler just said, and this should come as no surprise. Indeed, these traditions have been formed through the historical events of each country, contributing importantly to each state's identity. These traditions, therefore, as long as they do not encroach on specific rights or specific connected to religious freedom, are totally legal, as the Strasbourg Court often ruled. State churches have been admitted by Strasbourg Court. They also approved of the ecclesiastical tax, as it is the case in Germany and in other countries in Central Europe, imposing whereby citizens should pay an additional tax for the different religions. The Court of Strasbourg also approved of restrictive measures as taken by different countries with reference to movies, paintings and books because of moral and religious reasons. So the rulings on the crucifix is liable to criticism for a different set of reasons that I wish not to dwell upon because they've been already clearly referred to by Professor Weiler. And yet let me just say one thing, because I believe I must. I must remind you indeed of what the President of the Italian Republic said with reference to the Strasbourg ruling. President Napolitano stated, based on the general principle of subsidiarity that has always inspired the rulings taken by the Court of Justice on human rights, the sensitive issue concerning the attitude to follow when it comes to religious symbols may be best tackled by independent countries. Independent countries indeed are better able to understand what is the widespread sentiment in their own premises within the same country. And then President Napolitano highlighted the need to safeguard and enhance the identity heritage and the value heritage as expressed most specifically by European countries through the age-old presence of Christian and Catholic religion. I also wish to highlight something that happened in other European countries, because you might not know that the Court of Strasbourg is indeed an institution of the Council of Europe. And the Lisbon Treaty, ruling the European Commission, guarantees that national traditions are to be complied with. Indeed, each religion, each religious communities should enjoy total freedom based on the national law. The treaty also recognized the public importance of religions, since it recognizes the identity and the specific content of individual religions' confessions, establishing an open dialogue with them. Now, with reference again to the Strasbourg ruling, there's one thing which I like to add, maybe just a line, but not just that, as a matter of fact. If the principles of the Strasbourg ruling were to be implemented across the board with rigor, well then, as a strange consequence was ensue, that is, that all countries that are members to the Council of Europe should forego using the calendar as they actually do, as they know it. Because, there's something to consider, and that the calendar we use is based very much on the day and year when Christ was born. And so the birth of Christ is actually at the very center of history as we start counting the days after that. The French Revolution realized the full potential of the religious calendar, so much so that it had replaced it with its own calendar, drawing inspiration and based on Enlightenment principles. I don't know whether the Court of Strasbourg is doing likewise, but this is what actually the ruling states. So what is the problem then? The presence of religious symbols is again there to stay, as it is a feature that we find across the board. Do not even mention Orthodox countries where you often have a national church, not to think about the Slav countries where the thing is even more obvious. So we have to take stock of the fact that there's a secular mentality prevailing that holds a minority position, but it is growing. And that is echoed not just in the rulings by certain judges and in bulky essays, but also in what mass media state. Indeed, the mass media often give large coverage to that as if it was a progressive stance and a prevailing attitude. Furthermore, according to a number of scholars, the Strasbourg ruling would be part of a project aiming at the neutralization of the public space in Europe, making it mandatory for all countries, irrespective of their constitutions, to be secular as France is. And then France is not as so secular as we consider it being. This attitude is based on an ideology which is characterized by bias, an anti-religious bias. According to the champions of this ideology, religion as a phenomenon is part of our irrational nature, and as such may not be part and parcel of a modern society. Individual religions indeed oppose progress, according to these people, oppose the dissemination of scientific knowledge, bring about gaps and distinction between men, promoting also fundamentalism that then lead to violence and fanaticism. So basically, the final objective would be to do away with them altogether, and we have to work actively for that purpose, according to these people. But certainly religious symbols should be away from the public space. And there are quite a number of authors that maintain these stances even in the national press. If you read them, you might know. We're not questioning the right of those who embrace such ideas to repeat that publicly and privately as they like. This is not the problem. So there is nothing obviously opposing the freedom of speech, but these principles cannot be imposed as if they were the inspiring principles of our social coexistence without any kind of discussion and with false pretext. The opposition to the presence and display of religious symbols in public spaces, of Catholic religious symbols, is often motivated with the need to protect minority religions. Whereas there's a negative approach towards all kinds of religions. Many appeals have been made to the use of such religious symbols, but apparently none has been put forward by a religious community. By the way, when the French state did not ban the use of the chador in public schools, against this ruling, the Muslim authority and the Grand Rabbi of Paris and the Catholic authority in Paris opposed that. The opposition to display of religious symbols in public spaces seem also to originate in other ideologies. A widespread opposition, hostility to the sense of belonging as such. I'm referring to that notion in the civil society whereby elements such as the constitutions would be considered as disgregating the national unit, as if it was a third party between the citizen and the state. Paolo Grossi wrote, "The modern age, basing itself on the 18th century, doing away with all the intermediate society, carried out an important operation as it reduced the legal vision to just two possibilities, either the macro individual, the state, or the micro individual, i.e. the citizen, with nothing in between. So the state and the individuals are both attached to much importance. So the state is the supreme state, and the individual is isolated, has no belonging, and has no groups. And this is a conception, according to Grossi, that we cannot overcome, so much so that there are some legal experts that still promote this vision. I could quote other examples, but I don't do so just because of time constraints. Just 2 more lines to comment the Italian situation. In Italy, as of late, discussions on bioethics and family have seen a number of politicians supporting the assumption whereby believers should abstain from certain behaviors as they hold it incompatible with their own personal beliefs, and yet they should not make it impossible for others. The same could be, for example, said for divorce. Catholics may not divorce, but they couldn't ban other people from divorcing, though. This is one of the stances. So basically, believers should obviously comply with the legislation of the state and then can behave as they like. And yet they are not qualified to promote any legislation mirroring their own conviction on the human being, on the society. These conceptions, as based on the religious issues, are to be limited to their personal spheres, to their consciences. I don't think it's worth it for me to refer to the criticism that were leveled against these assumptions. I'd just like to point out to you that these assumptions are totally incompatible with the fundamental right of man to religious freedom, because according to these rights, believers could express following their own faith with all the possible consequences at political, social and other spheres. Well, then obviously, because we're in a democracy, the end is not said. And then a democratic society may accept the moral and the religious convictions. Benedict XVI considered as a total hypocrisy the tolerance of the principle of God as a private part of thought. We could not have discrimination against different citizens. All and everybody have the right and duty to comply with the Constitution when it comes to organizing public life in the different aspects. So all citizens can do so, but believers, because believers cannot act just based on their deepest religious convictions. I could add something to that. This is a piece of criticism which is often targeted towards certain believers, if not directly towards the hierarchies. When bishops take the floor when it comes to assisted conception. So I don't think that we should dwell anymore on the criticism leveled against these bishop speeches. There's a journalist at the Corriere della Sera who stated that quite a number of lay people use some kind of green light when the hierarchy agrees on what they say that Cattolica can talk about that, but if they go against their beliefs, then they cannot say that anymore. And this is true both in the right-wing party and in the left-wing party. So whatever the bishops say when it comes to sensitive issue may be both congratulated against and criticized. The lively reactions that a bishop's statement cause are to be looked at with great attention, as they are synonymous with some kind of intolerance, hostility, not so much with reference to certain moral doctrines or Christianity as a whole, but rather on church, on the intolerance vis-à-vis the church. The church should have no right to express itself when it comes to subjects that are part of the state body of laws. using institutional arguments even. So, for example, a letter that is published without any comment on a national paper presents a theory whereby the Church could not talk with reference to the Italian affairs as it is part of another country, i.e. the Vatican. And this is certainly quite a worrying statement, because Catholics basically are here considered as if they were second-category citizens, as often happened in past history. And indeed, we also, as Catholics, have been exposed to some kind of threat, as if the Church could stay silent, otherwise they won't see the contribution in terms of a percentage of the tax as paid by the taxpayers. According to our constitution, indeed, a certain tax quota can be granted to religious institutions. There were those who observed that the statements of the church hierarchy are certainly to be accepted, but not so if there is a concordato or disagreement between the Vatican and the Italian Republic. And this is very creative as an interpretation. Indeed, the Concordato states that certainly the Church has a say when it comes to social issues. Article 1st may be considered as knowledgeable, but indeed they are not, because they've never read the text of the document of the Concordat. The Italian State and Church are fully committed to cooperate for the promotion of man and the good of the country. This is what the Concordat reads. To conclude, I'd wish to say that the Church, to be loyal to its mission, cannot and should not be neutral when it comes to political issues. It is certainly not connected to any political regime, and yet it should claim for itself its right and duty to preach wherever the faith and to teach its doctrine on society, exerting its mission amongst men, providing its moral judgment also on political subjects and issues, if that is necessary for the person and for the soul of believers. In the situation of our country, therefore, which is one of the best worldwide, religious freedom cannot be considered as something to be taken for granted. Religious freedom is something that has to be always claimed for and safeguarded against any attempt to confine it and limit it. I wish to highlight the fact that this is true especially when it comes to education and culture. As John Paul II stated, the right of man, more than the legislation, are values that are to be safeguarded and cultivated within the society. Otherwise, they run the risk of being removed from the books of law, or they could be confined to the books of law without it having any repercussion on real life. In any case, the most effective means that the believers have in their hands to safeguard the religious freedom is that of exercising this right across the board, with public cult, with religious symbols in public spaces, carry out social work. So it is this perspective of presence that the Fra Giuliano has always taught to us. And this may be exemplified by the very essence of this meeting. Thank you.
Grazie davvero, perché appunto, come vedete, il tema si amplia.
Thank you very much. So you see that we had quite an accurate interpretation of the things. Now I'd like to give the floor to President Amato, who's a most distinguished guest and who's going to draw the conclusions on the subject. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. And there's a reason why I got invited. I've been saying for quite a while now exactly the opposite of what seems to prevail when it comes to secularism or secularity. We don't have to keep religions out. We need to keep religions in, rather. In order to live together, in order to hope in the future of this world, in order for us to hope that social life may change so that we can recognize ourselves in the neighbor, to allow for communities to live together and see this being together over and above the economic vision. There are those that still refer to this as to brotherhood amongst human beings. So if the future of the world should be inspired by the principle of brotherhood, and as I was saying during the press conference, if the future of the world is going to be just like Babel, but a kind of Babel where different people should learn to learn of each other, get to know each other, respect each other. Well, if this is what the future should be, your faith should not be left out of the public sphere. You should not leave it just under the doormat when you move around to get to know other people. This is a subject that is often found with all democracies. I'm sure you are familiar with what Beckenferber maintained, i.e. democracies being based on a dilemma. Democracies themselves are based on the mutual respect, on the recognition of human dignity in each of us. Democracy, indeed, is a set of rights and duties that are recognized for all the members of it. And by the way, a word of warning there. In Italy, this tends to be all too often forgotten. So much so that democracies tend to work based on the majority principle. This is certainly quite true, and yet liberty and freedom and rights are to be enjoyed by all and everybody, not just by the majority. No majority whatsoever, indeed, has the power to deprive those that are not part of the majorities of their rights. And so the democracy that would work based on the majority principle is not in a position as to safeguard its prerequisites, because what is the legal rule that may guarantee that the civil and moral qualities that are essential for a democratic system to be effective? This is a dilemma that may be solved by something that comes first, by something that lies in the conscience of each of us, something that lies with the values which we trust, with the principles to which we draw inspiration for our daily activities. Well, these principles are indeed what these religions teach. These principles are what make private life and public life work, and they are extraordinarily necessary for both public and private lives. So you might wonder how it happened that, as Professor Weiler said at the beginning, that the public sphere should be synonymous with the absence of faith. I don't know who said this, as if, again, religious values should be somewhere distinct and remote from public life. I don't know how come that people said that religion only bears on what lies beyond secular life. Well, there is an element of truth there. As a matter of fact, religion certainly includes in it an element of transcendency. As you are, obviously, you think that there is a God above us, with whom believers believe they can spend the rest of their lives when they in the next world. And yet this doesn't naturally mean the opposite, and that is that a storm may not be connected to religious sentiments. As a matter of fact, if you want to insist on this distinction, and I firmly believe in that, the problem is that there's some confusion between the fact that in European countries there's an historical issue and has been there for centuries, whereby institutions, the state, are separate from the religious institutions, as if this had no connection with what happens inside our conscience. So obviously in our conscience there could be no such separation. We usually say things that have to do with our present lives are to be dealt with by the state, whereas the things that have to do with our religious life are to be dealt with by the church. This means that if you're a thief, then you'll be judged by the state. And then, if you have a child, it is the state that basically certifies that that child is son of yours. Whereas it is up to the church to decide whether they want to admit you to religious rites or the sacraments based on your past behaviors, whereby you potentially have breached with the rules. It is up to the church to ordain priests and decide on their on their lives, and decide. And it is up to the church, obviously, also to decide if a priest should not be ordained. But this has nothing to do with the fact that most of what is secular, when we live our secular lives, may certainly be affected by religious values, if you trust in those, by the principles from which you draw inspiration, if that is the case. Should religion just be connected to the next world? Well, then it would be your right to be believer as only after you've died. And this is obviously a paradox, an absolute paradox. Based on that principle, you wouldn't be believers in your daily life, because that would be a breach of the neutrality principle, whereby the public sphere should be again totally neutral with reference to religious affairs. It is quite the opposite, in fact. You have not the right, but rather, and I'm thinking as a citizen, I'm not thinking about the religious man, I believe that you have the duty, not just the right, to take your faith in the discussions, in the decisions, where we often deal with things that have moral aspects to them. This is all too often forgotten, unfortunately. I'm not just thinking about bioethics, because now we say that religion is back because there are things that have to do with life and death. Well, certainly this is the case, but all issues that are being tackled in the public sphere, for the very reason that decisions are made in one direction or the other, imply that a moral choice is made. Professor Feliciani was rightly recalling the fact that when you decide to send the Romas away, isn't that connected with some kind of moral choice? Can't you think that the Romas being sent away can only be seen as an issue of law and order? If I'm a religious man, if I'm a believer, obviously I'm brought to thinking that the Romas are my own neighbors, my own brothers. We're all sons of one, children of one God, Romas included. And if the Romas are children of God, can I actually send them away, ignoring this important brotherhood, this community that my own religion teaches me? You see, this is the point. There are no discussions whereby the religion would play no role. Nearly all issues are somewhat connected to the religion. Well, obviously, if the decision has to be made with reference to a condominium, well, that perhaps has no connection with religious issues. For example, if within a certain building we have to decide whether we have the unanimity or a certain percentage of ownership that makes a decision for the remainders of the building, well, this probably has nothing to do with religions. But usually the decisions always include a choice between what is right and what is not right. And usually what is right is when somebody who's done something wrong is being punished. And I believe that there could be some good also in someone perpetrating evil, but I think that we could talk at length about that. There is an essential item that I wish to highlight. Religion is not part of the public sphere. Religion should therefore be interpreted. This is the subject. Where countries where the church had secular property might be more reactive. One thing is the hierarchy of the church. Making decisions that have repercussions in their own spheres, and the bishops taking a stance may be better heeded in Italy than in a country which is far from the Catholic religion. This is a problem of authoritativeness, because then in the end it is always the conscience of the individual that makes the final decision. It is always the conscience of the single individual that makes the final decision. And what is important is for the individual to heed his or her conscience. We shall not forget a basic issue there, and that is that each of us, believers included, are part of the public sphere as citizens. And as citizen implies that we should all bring our religious faith with us, or whatever we believe in, but we have to do so discussing issues with our neighbors, with the others, considering also the potential reactions that others may have. Benedict XVI highlighted the important principle of making generalization. This is a subject whereby you can have your religious creed being respected. Obviously, in the public sphere, you cannot have all principles being complied with, all principles whatsoever that may be part and parcel of your religion. You live in a country where other religions exist, and had existed for some time in certain cases. Different interpretations are given to other religions by the ones who are believers. Professor Weiler made an example, and I'd like to follow his example by stating, imagine if in Italian Parliament law was to be, or bill was to be proposed leading to the killing of adulterous women by stone throwing. Well, the Quran may consider that. I don't think that any God whatsoever, since in monotheistic God, the God is always the same, irrespective of how we refer to them. Well, I don't think that any God may make it mandatory for a man to kill their neighbor, because killing a man is in fact denying God. This is how I consider killing. And I don't think that the single God that is maybe named as Allah states something completely different from what our God says. There are those who maintain that adulterous women are to be killed by stone throwing, but if this is proposed in the Parliament, obviously you would oppose this, as this goes against the fundamental principles that have to do with the right of the human being and civil coexistence. So the principle of generalization and the tolerance for our neighbor, as Professor Weiler said, this is what is important. The public sphere, and Maritain would refer to that as well, the public sphere is something where you might meet different natural societies, or better said, natural different communities, i.e. the religious community is one of the natural communities, but where again others are to be met, and with such others together they have to accomplish the common good. I'd like to leave you with an important take-home message. First, living with others in this coexistence, the values of believers are to be contributed. Your values as believers are not to be left outside. Your set of beliefs are to be considered as part and parcel of the way you are when you look at the reality, and when you want to try and find a solution to any problem. At the same time, you have to know how to do this. That is, you have to be able to highlight what is right according to your religion. So if you see that you deny the other by insisting with your own religion, well, then you have to question yourself and decide up to what extent do I have the right to impose myself to others, exacting from the others that they should be exactly the same as ourselves. The only wrong thing that I wish to point out is that the public sphere cannot be said as the sphere where there's no room for absolute. This is another way whereby religion is kept out from the public sphere. In a public sphere of the democracy, the very fact that majority should make decision and not the minority is an absolute truism as well. The fact that according to democracy all human beings are exactly equal, and being equal, no laws should be passed privileging any specific group of citizens is another absolute truism. So certainly absolute truisms are part of that, but all of us should know that there always a boundary, a constraint, a limit. The real difference between absolute fanaticists and not fanaticists lies very much in this knowledge of the limit. The principle of hubris is always to be maintained when we go over, where we do something in excess. This runs counter the principles of religion. The boundary between the creator and the creature lies with the way we may debate. I can debate, but I cannot be always so self-confident as to exclude radically that others may contribute, thus enhancing my interpretation or arriving at a better solution for the common good. And this is why it often happened to me to criticize the non-believers vis-à-vis the believers, because believers do make the distinction between the creator and the creature. And they are often better aware of the existence of a limit that cannot be exceeded. The goddess of reason, the one that sometimes crops up as it used at the time of others in the 19th century, well, the goddess of reason tend to provide us with solutions that are as so true as not to admit any reaction or contradiction. And this is where we should look out for danger, because this can actually lead towards totalitarianism and dictatorship in the cultural dictatorships. Now, by way of conclusion, I wish to say that we are going towards, we are heading for Babel. We are heading for a society wherein we are going to be different from our neighbor, and the distinction that we are used to seeing in Italy, which is the one that we term between believers and non-believers, well, that distinction is one which is going to be ever more accompanied by another distinction, that is by those who believe in one religion, those who believe in other religions, and such religions becoming ever more numerous. And in this Babel, we have to exploit all its potential. I'm no theologian, so I cannot interpret the Holy Scriptures. I know for sure that Babel is often looked at by interpreters as a malediction. That thing which we term globalization is exactly synonymous with this Babel. Babel is being perhaps shaped back, so that Babel that exploded are now learning to live one next to the other in the globalization process. The Almighty might have wanted to teach us to live better, living together with our different neighbors. And this is what we read in the Quran, even a very nice passage where we read, I have created you with nations and tribes, and not for you to remain isolated following your own tradition, but rather because you should learn to get to know each other and love each other. And, well, I believe that this is a nice Quran, and I wish that all would take this as the beginning of our action. Thank you.
Grazie a tutti I relatori.
I'd like to thank all speakers and more specifically the last speaker. Indeed, President Amato actually refer to our past experience. We're very willing to get to know other people because you know that this desire for happiness and justice is something which is part and parcel of us all, and this is why we have the mystery in ourselves. So thanks to Giorgio Feliciani, who recalled us that religious liberty has to be exercised in order to be safeguarded. And I'd like to thank again, as always, thanks to Professor Weiler for his big heart with reference to the Friends of the Meeting, and for recalling us that we certainly have good arguments to fight for Europe not being flattened down, but rather a Europe which is not neutral, but Europe that can be truly the place for different peoples to live together with big hearts. Thank you very much.
Yeah.